The morning Juliet Bennett woke to find her last mule dead in the barn was the morning she realized she might lose everything her husband had died trying to protect. She stood in the dim light of dawn, her calloused hands gripping the splintered wood of the stall door, staring at the old animal that had helped her plow the meager fields of her Texas farm for the past year, since Thomas had been laid to rest. The summer of 1878 had been merciless, and here in the scrubland outside Shafter, the drought had turned her soil to dust and her hopes to something even finer. At 24, she was already a widow, already worn thin by work and grief, and now she stood alone with a farm that demanded more than one woman could possibly give. She buried the mule herself that afternoon, her muscles screaming as she dug through the hard earth with a shovel that felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The sun beat down on her back through the thin cotton of her work dress, and sweat plastered her dark hair to her neck. By the time she finished, her hands were bleeding through the rags she had wrapped around them, and her vision swam with exhaustion. She stumbled back to the small wooden house Thomas had built with such pride, collapsed at the kitchen table without bothering to wash, and laid her head on her arms. For the first time since his death, she let herself wonder if it was time to give up. The next morning came anyway, indifferent to her despair. Juliet dragged herself out of bed before dawn, splashed water on her face from the basin, and pulled on her work dress and boots. The chickens needed feeding. The garden needed watering from the precious well. The fence on the east pasture had 3 broken rails that she had been meaning to fix for a week. Without the mule, she would have to turn the soil for the winter wheat by hand if she had any hope of planting. She walked out into the cool pre-dawn air and began her day the way she began every day, with work. She was trying to manhandle a fence rail into place 2 hours later when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Juliet froze, her heart suddenly pounding. Out here, visitors were rare, and not all of them were friendly. She reached for the rifle she had learned to keep nearby and turned toward the sound. A single rider was approaching from the east, silhouetted against the rising sun. She raised the rifle to her shoulder and waited. The rider slowed as he drew closer, raising one hand in a gesture of peace. "Easy there, madam," a man's voice called out. "Not looking for trouble, just passing through and saw you might need a hand." Juliet kept the rifle steady. "I am managing fine on my own." The rider came close enough that she could see him clearly. He was tall, lean in the way of men who spent their lives in the saddle, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly beneath his hat. His horse was a good one, well cared for, and his clothes were worn but clean. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe 30. His eyes were an unusual shade of hazel that caught the morning light as he studied her with what looked like genuine concern. "Madam, no disrespect intended, but you have got blood on your hands. That fence rail is about to fall on your foot, and I can see from here that you have been crying." His voice was gentle but direct. "My name is Henry Walker. I have been working cattle up north, but the ranch sold out from under us last month. I am heading south looking for work, and I would be happy to help you with whatever you need in exchange for a meal and maybe a place to sleep in your barn for a night." Juliet wanted to send him away. She wanted to prove she could do this alone, that she was strong enough, that she did not need anyone. But her hands hurt and the rail was heavy, and she was so tired she could barely stand. She lowered the rifle slowly. "One night," she said, "in the barn, I can pay you in food but not in money." Henry Walker swung down from his horse with easy grace. "Food is more valuable than money most days, madam. Thank you." He tied his horse to the fence and walked over to where she stood. Up close, she could see the kindness in his face, the little lines around his eyes that came from squinting into sun and wind. He smelled like leather and horse and the wide open spaces, and when he took the fence rail from her hands, his fingers brushed hers, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time, something that made her step back quickly. "Where does this need to go?" he asked, seeming not to notice her reaction. She showed him, and he fixed it in minutes, using skill and strength that made the job look easy. Then he looked around at the farm with an assessing eye. "What else needs doing?" "Everything," she said before she could stop herself. The word came out bitter and exhausted. "Everything needs doing, and there is just me to do it." Henry was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Why do you not show me around and we can make a plan? Sometimes things look worse than they are when you are facing them alone." So she showed him. The small house that needed new shingles where the roof was starting to leak. The chicken coop where a fox had been getting in and stealing eggs. The fields where the earth was too hard for her to turn without a plow animal. The well that was getting low. The garden where she had managed to keep vegetables growing through sheer stubbornness and precious water. The barn where his horse would stay and where she would give him a blanket for the hayloft. He listened without judgment, occasionally asking a question. "How long have you been working this place alone?" 14 months, she said. "My husband Thomas died last June, kicked by a horse. He was gone before I could even get to town for a doctor." "I am sorry," Henry said, and he sounded like he meant it. "That must have been hard." Hard does not begin to cover it. She looked out at the fields, at the dreams she and Thomas had shared. "We had plans. We were going to build this into something good. Run cattle, grow wheat, maybe start a family. Now I am just trying to keep from losing the land." "You have been doing that alone for over a year." Henry shook his head. "That takes a lot of strength, or a lot of stubbornness. Sometimes they are the same thing." He smiled at her, a warm, genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "What if I stayed on for a bit? Not just one night. I could help you get things back in order. I know farming and ranching both. I am good with my hands and I work hard. You could pay me in food and shelter until we get the place profitable, then we could work out wages." Juliet stared at him. "You want to work for just food? That makes no sense. You could hire on anywhere for real money." "Maybe," Henry said, "but everywhere I go they are looking to pay as little as possible and work a man into the ground. Here, I would be helping someone who really needs it, doing work that matters." "And your cooking smells good coming from that kitchen window." She had been making bread that morning before going out to work on the fence. Despite everything, she felt a small smile tug at her lips. "You are saying you would work for bread, among other things, yes." He turned serious. "Look, madam, I can see you are in a tough spot. I have been in tough spots myself. Sometimes what makes the difference is having someone in your corner. Let me help. If it does not work out, I will move on. But I think between the two of us, we could turn this place around." She should have said no. She should have sent him away like she had sent away the few other men who had offered to help over the past months, men whose eyes held calculations she did not like, men who looked at her land with more interest than they looked at her needs. But Henry Walker's eyes were steady and honest, and she was so tired of being alone. "All right," she heard herself say. "We can try it for a week and see how it goes." That was how Henry Walker came to stay at the Bennett farm and how everything began to change. The first few days were awkward. Juliet was not used to having anyone around, and she had developed her own routines, her own way of doing things. Henry respected her space, asking before he touched anything, checking with her before he started on a task. He slept in the barn as agreed and took his meals on the porch rather than assuming he was welcome at her table. He worked from sunup to sundown without complaint, fixing the chicken coop so the fox could not get in, patching the roof, reinforcing the barn door that had been hanging crooked. On the third day, he said, "We need to talk about plowing. You cannot turn that soil by hand, not the acreage you need for wheat. We need a mule or an ox." "I know," Juliet said tightly. "I buried my last mule 5 days ago. I do not have money for another." Henry thought for a moment. "There is a man I know over in Fort Davis, about 30 miles east. He owed me a favor from years back. What if I rode over there and see if I can work something out? Maybe borrow a mule for the plowing season." "Why would he do that?" "Because I saved his life once, and he told me if I ever needed anything, he would help." Henry shrugged. "I never collected on that. Might be time to do it." He rode out the next morning and returned 2 days later with a strong young mule and a small bag of seed wheat. "John said to consider the wheat a gift," Henry explained as Juliet stared in disbelief. "The mule is a loan until spring. By then we should have some money coming in and can buy our own." "Our own." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Henry looked at her steadily. "You said we had a week to see if this worked out. The week is almost up. I would like to stay if you will have me. I think we make a good team." They did make a good team. It surprised her how much easier everything was with help, how much more got done when there were 2 sets of hands instead of one. But more than that, she found she liked having Henry around. He had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh, something she had not done in months. He was patient with her when she got frustrated, strong when she felt weak, and he treated her like a partner rather than someone to be managed or pitied. "Stay," she said. "Please. I will find a way to pay you proper wages." "We can figure that out when the harvest comes in," Henry said. "For now, let us just focus on getting this farm running right." They plowed the fields together, Henry guiding the mule while Juliet followed behind, breaking up the larger clods of earth. It was back-breaking work, but there was something almost meditative about it, about working in rhythm with another person, about slowly transforming the hard, barren ground into something that could sustain life. They planted the wheat on a cool October morning, walking the furrows side by side, and when they finished, Juliet stood at the edge of the field and felt something she had not felt since Thomas died. She felt hope. The weeks passed, and winter settled over the Texas scrubland. It was not a harsh winter by the standards of northern places, but the nights were cold and the days were short. Henry continued to sleep in the barn despite Juliet's growing concern about him freezing out there. She brought him extra blankets and found excuses to invite him into the house more often. They would sit by the fireplace after supper, Juliet mending clothes while Henry carved small figures from scraps of wood, his hands sure and skilled. They talked about everything and nothing. He told her about growing up in Oklahoma, about his parents who had died of fever when he was 16, about the years he had spent working cattle drives and ranches across Texas and New Mexico. She told him about her childhood in San Antonio, about meeting Thomas at a church social when she was 19, about their dreams for this farm. "You miss him?" Henry asked one night, his voice quiet. "Every day," Juliet said honestly, "but it is different now than it was. At first it was like I could not breathe, like the world had ended. Now it is more like a scar, still there, still tender sometimes, but I can live with it." "He would be proud of you," Henry said, "for fighting so hard to keep this place going." "I hope so." She looked at Henry across the firelight. "I could not have done it without you. You know that, right? I was ready to give up the morning you rode in. I am glad I came along when I did then." His eyes met hers and held them, and Juliet felt her breath catch. There was something in his gaze, something warm and wanting that made her heart speed up. She looked away quickly, confused by the strength of her own reaction. She had not thought about men since Thomas died, had not wanted to, had not felt ready. But Henry Walker was different. He had become part of her life so gradually, so naturally, that she had not noticed how essential he had become until suddenly she could not imagine her days without him. The realization frightened her. It felt like a betrayal somehow. Even though Thomas was gone and she was still alive, still young, still allowed to feel things. Christmas came and went quietly. They were too busy to do much celebrating, but Juliet made a special supper and presented Henry with a shirt she had sewn from fabric she had been saving. He gave her a carved wooden box with intricate flowers on the lid, beautiful enough that she caught her breath when she opened it. "When did you make this?" she asked, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Nights in the barn. I have been working on it for a while." He looked almost shy. "I wanted you to have something nice." She wanted to kiss him. The urge came over her so strongly that she had to turn away, clutching the box to her chest. "Thank you," she managed. "It is beautiful." The wheat came up green and strong in early spring, and both of them watched over it like anxious parents. The rains came at the right times, not too much and not too little. Henry brought home 3 young calves he had gotten in trade for some work he did for a neighboring rancher, and they started the beginning of a herd. Juliet's garden flourished with Henry there to help build proper irrigation channels from the well. The chickens laid prolifically. The farm was not just surviving anymore, it was beginning to thrive. "We should think about building a proper bunkhouse," Juliet said one morning in April. "You cannot keep sleeping in the barn." "I do not mind the barn," Henry said, but there was something in his voice that made her look at him sharply. "But you would rather not sleep there." He was quiet for a moment. "I would rather sleep wherever you want me to sleep." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Juliet's heart hammered in her chest. "Henry, I know I am just a hired hand," he said quickly. "I know I do not have any right to say anything. But Juliet, you have to know how I feel about you, how I have felt for months now. I wake up thinking about you, and go to sleep thinking about you, and spend all day working beside you wishing I had the right to take your hand or put my arm around you, or tell you how beautiful you are when the sun lights up your hair." She stared at him, unable to form words. Part of her had seen the way he looked at her, the way he found excuses to stand close, the way his voice softened when he said her name. But hearing him say it out loud was different. "I am still married," she whispered. "In my heart I am still married." "I know," Henry said gently. "And I would never ask you to dishonor that. I just wanted you to know, so you could make a choice with all the information." He walked away then, heading out to check on the cattle, leaving her standing alone in the yard with her thoughts spinning. She went into the house and sat at the kitchen table, Thomas's face smiling at her from the small photograph on the mantel. She had loved her husband, still loved him in a way. But he was gone and she was here, and Henry Walker was real and present and offering her something she had thought she would never have again. That night she lay awake for hours, wrestling with her conscience and her heart. By morning she had made her decision. She found Henry in the barn brushing down the mule. "I need to talk to you," she said. He turned to face her, his expression carefully neutral. "All right. I loved my husband," she began. "He was a good man and we had a good marriage. But he is gone, and I do not think he would want me to spend the rest of my life alone, refusing to let myself feel anything for anyone else." Henry's eyes widened slightly, but he did not speak. "I care about you," she continued, her voice shaking. "I do not know when it started exactly, but somewhere along the way you became more than just someone who works here. You became someone I look forward to seeing every morning. Someone I miss when you are gone, even for a few hours. Someone who makes me laugh and makes me feel safe and makes me think maybe there could be happiness again." "Juliet," he breathed, taking a step toward her. "I am scared," she admitted. "I am scared of dishonoring Thomas's memory. I am scared of getting hurt again." I am scared that I am making a terrible mistake, but I am more scared of sending you away and spending the rest of my life wondering what could have been." Henry closed the distance between them and took her hands in his. "I will never hurt you," he said fiercely. "I swear to you, Juliet, I will spend every day trying to make you happy. I will work this farm beside you and build a life with you and honor what you had with Thomas by giving you a future that is just as good, if you will have me." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will have you." He kissed her then, gentle and sweet and full of all the longing that had been building between them for months. Juliet melted into him, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, and for the first time since Thomas died, she felt whole again. Not because Henry was replacing what she had lost, but because he was offering her something new, something different, something that was theirs alone. They were married in Shafter 2 weeks later, standing before a justice of the peace with 2 witnesses pulled in from the street. It was nothing like Juliet's first wedding, which had been in a church with all her family present. But when Henry slipped the simple gold band onto her finger and promised to love and cherish her for all his days, she felt joy flood through her like sunlight. That night, in the house that was now truly theirs, Henry carried her over the threshold and set her down gently in the bedroom. "Are you sure?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. "We can wait if you need to." "I am sure," she said, and she was. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted to start this new chapter of her life with no more holding back. He undressed her slowly, reverently, his hands trembling slightly as he unlaced her dress and slipped it off her shoulders. She stood before him in her chemise and felt more nervous than she had on her wedding night with Thomas, because this was different. This was someone new, someone whose touch she did not yet know. But when Henry pulled her close and kissed her neck, her collarbone, the swell of her breasts, all nervousness melted away in the heat of wanting. She helped him out of his own clothes, fumbling a little with the buttons of his shirt, and then they were skin to skin, and it felt right in a way she had not dared to hope for. He made love to her tenderly at first, constantly checking that she was all right, that this was what she wanted. But as she responded to him, as her hands explored the lean muscles of his back and her body arched to meet his, he lost some of that careful control, and it became something wild and passionate and utterly consuming. When they finally lay tangled together in the aftermath, both breathing hard, Juliet felt tears on her cheeks. "Did I hurt you?" Henry asked immediately, concern flooding his face. "No," she said, laughing a little through the tears. "No, you did not hurt me. I am just happy. I did not think I could be this happy again." He pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "I am going to make you happy every day," he promised. "That is my job now. Your job is to help run this farm," she teased. "That too," he agreed, grinning. "I am very good at multitasking." The summer of 1879 was everything the previous summer had not been. The wheat grew tall and golden, and when they harvested it in July, they had enough to sell for good money and still keep plenty for themselves. The cattle herd had grown to 15 head, and Henry was already talking about buying more. The garden produced more vegetables than they could eat, so Juliet started selling the surplus in town. The farm was not just surviving anymore. It was flourishing, just like Juliet herself was flourishing under Henry's love and partnership. They fell into new rhythms together, learning each other's habits and preferences. Henry liked his coffee strong and sweet. Juliet liked to be left alone for the first hour after waking. Henry sang while he worked, old cattle drive songs that made Juliet smile. Juliet had a temper when things went wrong, flashing hot and then cooling down just as quickly. They had their first real fight in August over whether to invest their harvest money in more cattle or in a new barn, and Juliet was terrified that this would be the thing that broke them. But Henry did not storm off or shut down. He listened to her arguments and presented his own, and they talked it through until they reached a compromise that satisfied them both. "That was our first fight," she said that night as they lay in bed. "Probably will not be our last," Henry said pragmatically. "But I think we are pretty good at fighting, all things considered. We both said what we meant and we worked it out. That is how it should be." "Thomas and I never fought," Juliet said, then wished she had not mentioned her first husband, but Henry just squeezed her hand. "Thomas was a different person, and you were younger, and it was a different time in your life. You do not have to pretend he did not exist or that you do not remember him. He is part of your story. I am just grateful I get to be part of it too." She rolled over and kissed him, overwhelmed with love for this man who was so secure in himself that he was not threatened by her past. "You are the best part," she whispered. By fall they had built a new barn, splitting the cost of materials with the money from the wheat and money Henry earned doing some contract work for other ranchers. They bought 10 more cattle and a horse for Juliet, so she could ride out with Henry to check on the herd. They hired a man from town to help with some of the heavier work, a young Mexican fellow named Carlos who was quiet but reliable. The farm was becoming a real operation, something substantial and profitable. In October, Juliet realized her monthly courses were late. She did not say anything to Henry at first, not wanting to get his hopes up in case she was wrong. But when another week passed and she started feeling queasy in the mornings, she allowed herself to believe it might be true. She rode into Shafter and saw the doctor, who confirmed what she already knew in her heart. She was pregnant. She told Henry that night after supper. She had planned a whole speech about how she knew they had not talked about children yet, and maybe this was too soon. But the moment she opened her mouth, all that came out was, "I am going to have a baby." Henry stared at her for a heartbeat, his expression unreadable. Then his face split into the biggest smile she had ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that probably scared the chickens. He swept her up into his arms, spinning her around, laughing like a child. "Careful," she said, laughing too. "Put me down before you make me dizzy." He set her down but kept his arms around her, his hands gentle on her back. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby. Juliet, that is the best news I have ever heard in my life." "You are happy?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. Happy does not even begin to cover it. He kissed her deeply. "I am ecstatic. I am over the moon. I am the luckiest man in Texas." "We need to be careful," she said. "I am not very far along. Anything could happen." "Then we will be careful," Henry said firmly. "No more heavy lifting for you. I will handle the harder chores and we can hire more help if we need to. You just focus on taking care of yourself and that baby." He was as good as his word, becoming almost comically protective. He would not let her carry anything heavier than a basket of eggs. He insisted she rest in the afternoons. He brought her ginger tea when the morning sickness was bad and held her hair back when she could not keep anything down. Sometimes his hovering drove her crazy, and she had to remind him that she was pregnant, not made of glass, but mostly she found it endearing. The winter passed slowly. Juliet's belly grew round and her back ached and her ankles swelled, but the baby was healthy and active, and that was all that mattered. Henry would put his hand on her stomach in the evenings and marvel at the movements he felt. "What do you think it will be?" he asked one night. "Boy or girl?" "I do not know," Juliet said. "What do you hope for?" "I do not care," Henry said honestly. "As long as the baby is healthy and you are healthy, that is all I want." But when Juliet went into labor on a warm April morning in 1880, 20 hours of hard struggle later, the midwife from town placed a squalling, red-faced boy in her arms and said, You have a son." Juliet looked down at the tiny, perfect face of her child and felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. "Hello, little one," she whispered. Henry was crying openly, tears streaming down his face as he touched the baby's impossibly small hand. "He is perfect," he said hoarsely. "Juliet, he is absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" They had discussed names but never settled on one. Now, looking at her son, Juliet knew exactly what his name should be. "Henry," she said. "Henry Thomas Walker. After his father and after the man who would have been his uncle if things had been different." Henry looked at her with such love and gratitude that she felt tears spring to her own eyes. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," she said. "Thomas would have liked you. He would have approved of this. And I want our son to carry both of you with him." They called the baby Tommy to avoid confusion, and he became the center of their world. Juliet had worried that she might not know how to be a mother, but the moment she held her son, everything seemed to fall into place. She nursed him and rocked him and sang him the lullabies her own mother had sung to her. Henry was just as devoted, walking the floor with Tommy when he cried at night, changing his diapers without complaint, making silly faces to get him to smile. The farm continued to prosper even with a new baby in the house. They hired more help, bringing on Carlos's brother Miguel and a cowboy named Jack who had worked with Henry years before. The cattle herd grew to 40 head. They plowed more fields and planted more wheat. Juliet started a small orchard, planting apple and peach trees that would not bear fruit for years, but represented her faith in their future. They added rooms onto the house, a proper nursery for Tommy, and a guest room for when Juliet's family came to visit from San Antonio. Life was full and busy and good. Juliet would sometimes stop in the middle of a task and look around at everything they had built together, hardly believing this was her life. The failing farm she had been ready to abandon had become a thriving enterprise. The widow who had worked herself to exhaustion every day just to survive was now a wife and mother with help and hope and happiness. When Tommy was 2 years old, Juliet discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body remembering what to do. In the spring of 1883, she gave birth to a daughter they named Hope, because that was what Henry had given her when he rode into her life that desperate morning 5 years before. The years rolled on, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. They bought more land, expanding the farm to over 300 acres. The cattle operation became substantial enough that they hired a full-time foreman. They built a schoolhouse on their property and hired a teacher so Tommy and Hope and the children of their workers could get an education. Juliet started a church group for the women in the area, giving them a place to gather and support each other the way she wished she had been supported in those dark days after Thomas died. Henry was everything he had promised to be and more. He never stopped courting her, bringing her wildflowers from the fields, stealing kisses when the children were not looking, telling her she was beautiful even when she felt worn and tired. They had more fights over the years, disagreements about money and child rearing and how to run the farm, but they always worked through them. Their love matured and deepened, becoming less about passion and more about partnership, though the passion never entirely disappeared. Sometimes Juliet would catch Henry looking at her across the dinner table with heat in his eyes, and know that once the children were asleep, he would come to her with the same desire he had shown on their wedding night. When Tommy turned 8, he started helping with the cattle, riding out with Henry and the hands to check on the herd. Hope was more interested in the garden and the chickens, following her mother around and asking endless questions about how things grew. They were good children, healthy and happy and loved, and Juliet thanked God for them every single day. In 1887, Juliet realized she was pregnant for a third time. She was 33 now and had not expected to have more children, but when she told Henry, he was just as delighted as he had been with Tommy and Hope. 3 children, he said wonderingly. When I rode up to this farm 9 years ago, I never imagined I would end up with all of this. A wife I adore, children, a home. You gave me everything, Juliet. You gave it to me, she corrected. I was drowning when you arrived. You saved me. We saved each other, Henry said and kissed her. Their third child was another boy born in early 1888. They named him James, and he had his mother's dark hair and his father's hazel eyes. Tommy and Hope both doted on their baby brother, fighting over who got to hold him and help take care of him. Life was not always easy. There were droughts and hard winters. Cattle died from disease and crops failed sometimes despite their best efforts. They lost workers to other opportunities and had to train new ones. Henry broke his leg badly when a horse threw him in 1889 and was laid up for months, making Juliet remember with terrible clarity what it had been like when Thomas died. But Henry healed, and they weathered every storm together, their partnership strong enough to handle whatever came their way. In the summer of 1890, 12 years after Henry first rode onto her failing farm, Juliet stood on the porch of their house and looked out at everything they had built. The fields were green with growing wheat. The cattle grazed peacefully on the hills. The orchard she had planted years ago was heavy with fruit. Tommy, now 10, was working with his father and the hands, already skilled at handling horses. Hope was in the garden with 7-year-old James, teaching him how to tell weeds from vegetables. The house had been expanded and improved until it was one of the finest in the area. The barn was sound and well maintained. They had 3 good horses, 2 mules, a thriving herd of cattle, and chickens that produced more eggs than they could use. But more than all of that, they had love. The kind of love that got them up in the morning and kept them going through hard days. The kind of love that had transformed a desperate widow and a wandering cowboy into partners, into parents, into people who had built something lasting and real. Henry came up behind her and slipped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" "About how different things are from that morning you rode in," she said. "I was ready to give up. I had nothing left." "You had plenty left," Henry said. "You had strength and courage and determination. You just needed someone to help you see it." "I needed you," she said simply. "And I needed you," he replied. "Still do. Always will." She turned in his arms to face him, looking up at the man who had become her whole world. There were threads of gray in his dark hair now and lines around his eyes, but to her, he was just as handsome as he had been that first morning. "I love you," she said. "More than I ever thought it was possible to love someone." "I love you too," Henry said, and kissed her the way he had kissed her hundreds of times before, with tenderness and passion and the certainty of a man who had found exactly where he belonged. That evening, after the children were in bed, they sat together on the porch swing Henry had built, watching the sun set over the land they had brought back from the edge of failure. The cicadas sang in the trees, and the last of the day's heat rose from the earth. Henry held her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Juliet asked. "If you had ridden past that morning instead of stopping?" "Sometimes," Henry admitted, "but I do not like to think about it too much. It makes me sad to imagine a life without you and the children in it." "I think about it," Juliet said. "I think about how close I came to losing everything, how close I came to never knowing what we have now." "But you did not lose it," Henry pointed out. "You fought for it. You let me help you. You took a chance on a stranger who offered to work for food." "Best decision I ever made," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. Second best, he corrected. The best decision was saying yes when I asked you to marry me, she laughed. I will give you that one. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars come out. In the distance, they could hear the cattle lowing and the sound of the night birds beginning their songs. Everything was peaceful, everything was right. Henry, Juliet said softly. Yes, thank you for all of this. For saving the farm, for giving me a family, for loving me even when I was not sure I could love anyone again. He turned to look at her, his hazel eyes serious in the starlight. Juliet Bennett Walker, you do not ever have to thank me for loving you. It is the easiest thing I have ever done. From the moment I saw you trying to lift that fence rail with your hands all bloody and your chin set stubborn, I knew you were someone special. And every day since has just proven me right. You are going to make me cry, she said, blinking back tears. Then cry, he said gently. Cry because you are happy, because we made it, because we built something beautiful together out of almost nothing. So she did cry, happy tears that ran down her cheeks as Henry held her close. She cried for the woman she had been, exhausted and grieving and alone. She cried for the man who had stopped when he could have ridden on. She cried for the love they had found, the family they had made, the life they had built on the foundation of hard work and hope. The farm that had been failing was now one of the most successful in the region. The widow who had worked from sunup to sundown just to survive was now surrounded by love and abundance. And the cowboy who had joined her had made it all flourish. Not just the land but her heart as well. Years continued to pass in the gentle rhythm of farm life. Tommy grew into a strong young man who took on more and more responsibility with the cattle. Hope developed a gift for growing things that surpassed even her mother's skill. James was the clever one, always reading, always asking questions, talking about maybe becoming a lawyer or a doctor someday. Henry and Juliet watched their children grow with pride and wonder, marveling at the people they were becoming. In 1895, when Tommy was 17, a young woman named Sarah came to Shafter with her family. Tommy was smitten from the moment he saw her, and Henry and Juliet watched with amusement as their son went through the same awkward courtship they had seen play out between young people countless times. But there was something special about the way Tommy looked at Sarah, something that reminded Juliet of the way Henry had looked at her all those years ago. He is in love, she told Henry one night. He is, Henry agreed. Reminds me of someone I know. You were never that obvious, Juliet teased. I was worse, Henry said. At least Tommy is not making up excuses to work for her family just to be near her. You did not make up excuses, Juliet protested. I really did need help. I know, Henry said, pulling her close. But I would have found a reason to stay no matter what. I was lost the moment I laid eyes on you. Even after all these years, his words could still make her blush. Charmer, she accused fondly. Tommy and Sarah were married in the spring of 1897. A big celebration that brought together families from all over the region. Watching her son pledge his life to the woman he loved, Juliet felt the circle complete in some fundamental way. The farm that she and Thomas had started, that she and Henry had saved and built into something prosperous, would continue on through their children. The legacy would live on. Henry and Juliet built a small house on the property for Tommy and Sarah, close enough that they could all work together but far enough to give the young couple privacy. Within a year, Sarah was pregnant, and Juliet found herself preparing to become a grandmother at the age of 43. We are getting old, she told Henry, though she did not really feel old. She felt vital and alive and blessed. Speak for yourself, Henry said, grinning. I am in my prime. He still worked as hard as any man on the place, though Juliet had noticed he was slower to recover from long days, and occasionally complained about his back aching. But he was healthy and strong, and she pushed away the fears that sometimes crept in late at night, fears of losing him the way she had lost Thomas. Their first grandchild was a girl, born in the fall of 1898. Tommy and Sarah named her Julia after Juliet, and when Juliet held the tiny baby in her arms, she felt the overwhelming rush of love she had felt with each of her own children, different but just as powerful. "She has your eyes," Henry said, looking over Juliet's shoulder at the baby. "She has her mother's eyes," Juliet corrected, but she was pleased nonetheless. Hope married a few years later, a young rancher named David who worked land adjacent to theirs. James went off to Austin to study law, making good on his childhood dreams. The farm continued to prosper, now run by Henry and Tommy together, with Juliet managing the household and the garden and the chickens the way she had always done. In 1902, Henry and Juliet celebrated their 23rd wedding anniversary. It fell on a beautiful May day, warm but not hot, with a breeze that carried the scent of the blooming orchard. Their children and grandchildren gathered for a party, along with friends and neighbors and the people who worked on the farm. There was music and dancing and food, and Juliet looked around at all the people who had become part of their life and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. As the sun began to set, Henry took her hand and led her away from the crowd, walking with her to the place where he had first helped her fix that fence rail all those years ago. The fence was long gone now, replaced by better structures, but they both remembered. 23 years, Henry said. Best 23 years of my life. Mine too, Juliet said, though those first 14 months before you came along were pretty rough. I wish I had found you sooner, Henry said. I hate thinking of you struggling alone. Everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to, Juliet said firmly. I was not ready for you before Thomas died, and maybe you were not ready for me either. Maybe we both needed those years of wandering and struggling so we would recognize what we had when we found each other. Henry was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Maybe you are right. I had not thought of it that way, but I think you might be right. He pulled a small box from his pocket and handed it to her. I got you something. Henry, you did not have to do that, Juliet said, but she was already opening the box. Inside was a locket, delicate gold on a fine chain. She opened it and found 2 small photographs inside, one of Henry and one of Thomas. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. Henry. You loved him, Henry said simply. He was part of your life and part of what made you who you are. I wanted you to have both of us close to your heart because I know you carry both of us there anyway. She could not speak for a moment, too moved by the gesture. Finally she managed, help me put it on. He fastened the chain around her neck and she touched the locket, feeling the weight of it against her skin. Thank you, she whispered. This means more to me than you could possibly know. I know how much it means, Henry said. That is why I wanted to do it. They kissed as the sun set behind them, casting long shadows across the land they had built together. In the distance, they could hear their grandchildren laughing, the sound of the party continuing without them. But here, in this moment, it was just the two of them the way it had been at the beginning. I love you, Juliet, Henry said, more now than ever if that is even possible. It is possible, she said, because I love you more now than ever too. Love just keeps growing if you tend it right, like a garden. Like a farm, Henry added with a smile. Like a family, Juliet finished. They walked back to the party hand in hand, ready to rejoin the life they had created. The widow who had worked sunup to sundown on her failing farm had become a matriarch surrounded by children and grandchildren, living on prosperous land. The cowboy who had joined her had become a husband, a father, a grandfather, a man with deep roots and a legacy. Together they had made it all flourish, the land and the love, and they would continue to tend both for as long as they drew breath. The years rolled on, gentle and good. They watched more grandchildren come into the world. They saw Tommy take over more of the farm operations as Henry grew older. They celebrated James becoming a successful lawyer in Austin and Hope's husband expanding his ranch into one of the largest in the area. They weathered droughts and floods, economic downturns and personal losses. Henry's hair went completely gray and then white. Juliet's face gained more lines, her hands grew more gnarled with arthritis. But they still worked the farm together every day, still sat on the porch every evening, still loved each other with the same devotion they had always had. In 1910, Henry turned 60. Juliet was 56, and they had been married for 28 years. They had 4 grandchildren now, with a 5th on the way. The farm was being run by Tommy and a team of skilled workers, but Henry still went out every morning to check on things, unable to fully let go of the work that had defined so much of his life. "You should rest more," Juliet told him one morning, worried about the way he was moving slowly, one hand pressed to his chest. "I will rest when I am dead," Henry said, but he was smiling as he said it. "I've got too much to do to rest." "The farm will run fine without you hovering over it," Juliet said. "Tommy knows what he is doing. You trained him well." "I know," Henry said, "but I like being out there. I like seeing what we built. Makes me feel like my life has meant something." "Your life has meant everything," Juliet said fiercely. "To me, to our children, to everyone who has ever worked this land with you. Do not you dare suggest otherwise." He kissed her forehead. "I know. I am just feeling old today." "We are both old," Juliet said. "But we are still here, and we still have each other. That is what matters." On a warm afternoon in June of that year, Henry went out to check on a fence that Tommy had reported was down. He did not come back for supper. When Tommy went to find him, he discovered his father sitting under a cottonwood tree, his hat beside him, his eyes closed. He looked peaceful, like he had just decided to take a nap. But when Tommy touched him, he was already gone. The doctor said it was his heart, that he had probably died quickly without much pain. That was supposed to be a comfort, but Juliet could not find any comfort in it. Henry was gone, and even though she had known this day would come eventually, had feared it for years, she was not ready. She would never have been ready. The funeral was held on a beautiful summer day, and it seemed like everyone in the county came to pay their respects. Henry had been loved and respected, known for his fairness and his hard work and his devotion to his family. Person after person came up to Juliet to tell her stories about her husband, about kindnesses he had done, about ways he had helped them. She listened to them all, grateful for the confirmation that the man she had loved was worthy of that love. Tommy and Hope and James were devastated by their father's death. Juliet held them as they cried, though she herself was too numb to weep. She kept expecting to feel the overwhelming grief she had felt when Thomas died, the sense that the world had ended. But this was different. She was older now, and she had been through this before. She knew that life would continue, that the sun would rise tomorrow, that she would find a way to keep going. But it hurt. God, how it hurt. The days after the funeral were the hardest. The house felt too empty without Henry in it. His boots still sat by the door. His hat still hung on its peg. His side of the bed was cold and untouched. Juliet moved through the motions of living, but everything felt hollow. It was Tommy who finally got through to her. He came to the house a week after the funeral and found her sitting at the kitchen table staring at nothing. "Mama," he said gently, "you have to eat. You have to take care of yourself." "I know," she said, but she did not move. Tommy sat down across from her. "Papa would not want you to give up." "I am not giving up," Juliet said. "I am just I do not know how to do this again. I do not know how to be a widow again." "You are not alone this time," Tommy said. "You have me and Hope and James. You have your grandchildren. You have this farm and everyone who works on it. We are all here for you." Juliet looked at her son, at the man he had become, and saw Henry in his face. Henry's strength, Henry's kindness, Henry's steadiness. "You are so much like him," she whispered. "I hope so," Tommy said. "He was the best man I ever knew. I want to be like him." "You are," Juliet said. "You are exactly like him, and he was so proud of you." She started to cry then, finally, the tears she had been holding back since Tommy found Henry under that cottonwood tree. She cried for the man she had lost, for the life they had built together, for all the years they would not get to share. Tommy held her and let her cry, and when she was finally empty of tears, she felt a little bit lighter. "I will be all right," she told him. "It is going to take time, but I will be all right." "I know you will," Tommy said. "You are the strongest person I know." In the months that followed, Juliet slowly learned to navigate her grief. She visited Henry's grave every week, bringing flowers and talking to him about what was happening on the farm. She went through his belongings, keeping some things and giving others to their children. She found the little wooden figures he had carved in those early days when he slept in the barn, and she lined them up on the mantel next to the photograph of him. She kept working. That was what helped most, keeping her hands busy, keeping herself useful. She tended her garden and her chickens. She helped with the grandchildren. She managed the household accounts and planned meals for the workers. Work had always been her salvation, and it did not fail her now. One day in early fall, she was working in the garden when she found herself thinking about that morning 32 years ago when Henry had ridden up to her failing farm. She had been at the end of her rope, ready to give up, and he had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to pray. He had saved her farm, yes, but more than that, he had saved her. He had given her love and partnership and a life beyond anything she could have imagined. "Thank you," she said aloud, knowing somehow that Henry could hear her. "Thank you for stopping that morning. Thank you for staying. Thank you for loving me." The breeze rustled through the cottonwood trees, and Juliet chose to believe that was Henry's way of answering her. She lived for another 8 years after Henry died, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She watched the farm continue to flourish under Tommy's management. She saw James become a judge and Hope's children grow up and start families of their own. She rocked babies and told stories and passed on everything Henry had taught her about the land and about love. On a quiet morning in March of 1918, at the age of 64, Juliet Bennett Walker died peacefully in her sleep. She was laid to rest beside Henry under the cottonwood tree where he had spent his last moments, and their graves were marked with a simple stone that read, "Together they flourished." The farm continued on through the generations, passed down through Tommy's line and then his children's line. The original house was preserved and expanded, and the families that worked the land always knew the story of the widow who had almost lost everything and the cowboy who had helped her save it. It became part of the land's history, part of its foundation, a reminder that with hard work and love and partnership, anything was possible. The legacy that Juliet and Henry built together lasted far beyond their lifetimes. It lived on in the land they had restored, in the children they had raised, in the love they had shared. They had taken a failing farm and made it flourish, yes, but more than that, they had taken 2 broken, lonely people and made them whole. That was the real miracle, the real success. Not the acres or the cattle or the wheat, but the love that had transformed everything it touched, and in the end, that love was what mattered most. It was what endured, what lasted, what made all the hard work and struggle worthwhile. Juliet and Henry had found each other against all odds, had built a life together out of almost nothing, and had created something beautiful that would ripple out through time long after they were gone. That morning in 1878, when Henry Walker rode up to a failing farm and offered to help a desperate widow, neither of them could have known what they were starting. They could not have imagined the decades of love and work and family that stretched out ahead of them. They could not have seen the legacy they would leave, but they had taken the chance anyway. They had chosen hope over despair, partnership over isolation, love over fear. And that choice had made all the difference. The farm flourished because they worked it together. But more importantly, they flourished because they loved each other. And that love was strong enough to weather any storm, overcome any obstacle, and create a life worth living. In the end, that was the story worth telling. Not just of a widow and a cowboy who saved a farm, but of two people who saved each other and built something that would last forever.